carefully wraps the package as he has so many times before. It's small, inconspicuous, and at a single glance no one would ever suspect it was anything other than an ordinary freezer item. As he places it into the freezer, beside the other similar packages, he doesn't know that it's the last time he'll do it. In the complex chess game that has been his life so far, he's finally made the wrong move. And the one he thought was just another pawn is about to reveal his darkest secrets. The contents of his freezer will be just the tip of the iceberg. This is True Crime South Africa. I'm Nicole Engelbrecht, and you're listening to episode 199, The Crimes of Peter Frederiksen, Part 1. Shout out to this week's Patreon and PayPal superstars. A huge thank you goes out to Bean, Dillian Kruger, Mohammed Fazu, Annelies Marison, Stasha De Lange, Beth, and Jules Skonegeval for your support on Patreon. Thank you so much, everyone. Your support really does make a huge difference. This case has been on my to-do list for a very long time. I first heard about it from a friend who, although they shall remain anonymous, actually had a pretty close connection to this individual, at least in proximity. And you'll soon discover, as I did, that although the basic premise of what the offender was eventually arrested and convicted of is bad enough, that really was just the tip of the iceberg. Although many truly violent offenders do have a history of criminal conduct throughout their lives, it's pretty rare that we get a serious peek into their minds and their lifelong trail of destruction in the way we do here. Although I usually like to cover cases chronologically, I thought this one would be better told a little differently. I'll start with where we found the offender, and then through the evidence found during his arrest, we'll go backwards. Sadly, due to the nature of the case, I have very little information about the victims, but I have done my best to dig up as much as possible so that they too can be honoured. In researching this case, I used personal accounts supplied to me by a verified anonymous source, an article from the Savamas magazine, the judgment and sentencing documents, and a 5-part podcast series published by 2 Danish journalists who would unwittingly become deeply involved in this case. The podcast series is in Danish, so unless you understand that language, it may be a little pointless for me to refer you to it, as I myself had to have it translated to understand it. But it's important to me that I acknowledge my sources fully. So the podcast name translates to In the Blood of a Dane, and it is a Danish radio podcast created by journalists Jean Sterneklar and Helle Marge. This case is incredibly complex and detailed, so I'm going to be covering it in 2 parts. This is part 1, and part 2 will land in your feed shortly after this one's release. Please do note that this episode contains graphic descriptions of human mutilation, some mentions of possible cannibalism, and the sexual and other abuse of children. So, let's get into episode 199, The Crimes of Peter Frederiksen, Part 1.
The following episode may contain sensitive material, including descriptions of violence, sexual assault, or graphic descriptions of injuries to victims. If you feel you may be triggered by such material, please consider this before accessing our content. To access trauma counseling or services, please see the helpline information on our show notes.
Peter Frederiksen was born in Gammelholte, located in the Rudersdal municipality north of Copenhagen in Denmark in 1952. Even today, the area is one occupied by the relatively well-off. And when Peter was born in the 50s, the Frederiksen family were one of the most well-known and financially successful in the area. We'll delve a bit more into Peter's background in a minute. But for the purposes of structure, for now, we'll jump forward to 2006, when the then 52-year-old Peter boarded an aeroplane bound for South Africa. He chose to live in Bloemfontein, and it becomes clear later that this was a pretty strategic decision for a few reasons. One of those reasons is that Peter had always been obsessed with firearms, and there's a pretty big culture of firearm collecting and use in that area, with the farms and hunting and the like. In his first 4 years in South Africa, Peter struggled to make ends meet, but he eventually ended up buying an already running gun shop in Bloemfontein, and he soon became well known in the community there. Peter also opened a branch of his business, Impala Arms, in neighbouring Lesotho. The border post at Maseru in Lesotho is just over 1.5 hours drive from Bloemfontein. Lesotho is a kingdom and a separate country in its own right, which is entirely surrounded by South Africa. It's one of just 3 such enclaves in the world, and the largest of them, with the other 2 being San Marino and Vatican City. As a sovereign country, Lesotho has its own systems entirely separate from South Africa, and Peter seemed to enjoy his time in that country so much that he eventually purchased a house there. Lesotho is also the birthplace of the next person I'll be introducing you to, a young woman who would eventually bring Peter's house of cards crashing down, and sadly, pay the ultimate price for her bravery. Anna Matseliso Molise was born in Lesotho in 1988. She, like many Basotho, lived a difficult life economically, and with job opportunities being few and far between, it was always a possibility that she may need to head into South Africa at some point to find work. I learned something quite interesting while researching this case, which I'll share with you quickly. You've just heard me use the word Basotho, and that is the word that is used to describe the people of Lesotho. Unlike South Africa and many other countries, where the word used to describe the citizens is an extended form of the country's name, things work a little differently in the Mountain Kingdom. The word Lesotho means the land of the people who speak Sesotho, and the word for a single person from that country, a citizen, is Mosotho, while the term for a group of citizens of Lesotho is Basotho. So in South Africa, we'd say, I'm a South African, and a group of us are referred to as South Africans. In Lesotho, a citizen would say, I am Mosotho, and this group of citizens are Basotho. This is not to say that all people with Sotho heritage come from Lesotho either, as there are various groupings within that ethnic group, with some being indigenous to South Africa. Of course, there's a whole lot more I could get into around the history of what is now known as Lesotho, how it came to have its current borders, and how many Basotho people believe that parts of the Free States should actually be part of Lesotho instead of South Africa. I won't get any deeper into that here, but it truly is a fascinating topic to read up on if you have time. Anna has been referred to by various names in news coverage and in the judgment documents, including the name Tidi. But since we unfortunately cannot ask the young woman what she would prefer to be referred to as, I will use the name Anna here, as that was part of her name given at birth, and how her family referred to her in media quotes. In 2008, when Anna was 20 years old, she fell pregnant and gave birth to a daughter. Anna's daughter's name is withheld in most documents for legal purposes, and she is referred to by her initials, NM. So I will do the same. Or alternately, I'll refer to her as Anna's daughter, as she would only ever have one daughter. Having a child dependent on her increased the pressure on Anna to earn more money. And although she was able to get temporary work occasionally in Lesotho, she soon started considering leaving her daughter with her mother and heading into South Africa to find more stable work. By the time NM was 2, though, Anna would have a chance encounter at a hotel, which would change the trajectory of her life. On a beautiful summer's day in 2010, Peter Frederiksen was in Lesotho on business. He was sitting outside his hotel with a group of his colleagues, drinking and eating at a restaurant, when a young woman caught his eye. Anna was initially starry-eyed over Peter too. There was a considerable age gap between the pair, with Peter being 58 and Anna being 22. Many, including me, would identify this relationship as being predatory in several ways. The age gap in itself is a major power dynamic that does not shift in favor of Anna. She was also clearly incredibly vulnerable. She was a single mother, had no money, and no prospects. Peter presented himself as a wealthy businessman, and he had 2 well-known gun shops. He also owned property in Lesotho. And let's face it, not everyone partners up for love. And in some circumstances, such a partnership just might be equally beneficial to both in different ways, as long as it's not manipulative or harmful. But any security Anna may have hoped to get out of this relationship with this much older man would soon be outweighed by all the darkness she couldn't see at first. Within 2 weeks of meeting, Peter married Anna. If I were doing this podcast in video format, you'd see me putting air quotes around the word married. And that's not because it was a traditional or cultural ceremony. It was what seemed to be a completely legal ceremony performed in a magistrate's court in Lesotho. It was not legal, though. But Anna didn't know that, and she would not know that for another 6 years. Over the next 6 years, Anna would also come to learn a very different side to the man she had married. A violent, abusive, and sadistic side. The woman bore Peter 2 sons during that 6-year period, and as is so often the case, while a partner may come to put up with abuse against themselves, often once the abuse turns toward the children, the abused partner draws a line in the sand, and that is exactly what happened with Anna and Peter. As you'll hear later, Anna had tried to report Peter's abuse of her before, both in Lesotho and in South Africa. But on each occasion, she'd found her pleas falling on deaf ears. As you'll also later hear, those ears may have allegedly been made deaf by Peter himself, because they were filled with bribes or promises of access to weapons. Either way, though, by 2015, Peter had overplayed his hand. Anna had insisted on a divorce and was trying to get custody of her sons. Peter wasn't having any of it and reported her to child welfare with claims that she was neglecting and abusing the boys. This was Anna's breaking point, where she realized that she had to finally tell the whole truth, or she would never free herself of Peter Frederiksen. Over the course of a few hours, Anna sat in the office of a social worker, tasked with investigating Peter's claims. The young woman detailed the years of abuse she'd suffered at the hands of her husband. But it was 2 final claims she made that would blow everything wide open. Anna said that Peter had mutilated her genitals. She said that part of this involved removing her clitoris and part of her outer labia. She had kept the secret for a long time, And she told the social worker she wasn't the only one. If police looked in her husband's freezer, they would find many tiny packages. And inside those packages, they would find the mutilated genitalia of many victims. The social worker was skeptical, but she could not ignore this claim. The woman's information was too specific, and the children's safety was at risk if the claims were true. And so, on the 17th of September 2015, members of the Hawks, along with local police officers, raided the home of Peter Frederiksen. And they found exactly what Anna said they would. But, and this is the very reason I've structured this episode in this way, something else they would find in the house became an incredibly important part of understanding the true depth of Peter Frederiksen's crimes. Police found several diaries in Peter's bedroom. The diaries dated back over more than a decade, even before he'd come to South Africa. The diaries were in Danish, though, so the SAPS ended up partnering with those two Danish journalists I mentioned in the introduction, Jean Sterneklar and Helle Maj. They were living in South Africa at the time, and they'd spent 3 days interviewing Peter Frederiksen. The combination of the information they would eventually glean from those diaries, what the man had told them on camera for their interview, and the police investigation, opened up a huge number of inquiry paths. And with that information in hand, I can now take you from this point of his arrest right back to 1952 in Denmark and fill in the details. Details which I must tell you completely blew my mind. I must first say that what I'm about to share with you is a mixture of information that has and has not been proven in court. The two journalists who dug up most of this and were able to confirm certain things are seasoned at their work and very experienced. I will, however, point out when something is technically unproven, even if there's a lot to back it up. Peter Frederiksen had been born into a well-to-do family who was well known in the area. But Helle and Jean would soon learn some very disturbing details about their countryman's family during their investigation. Peter was one of 3 children. He had a younger brother and a sister. When the journalist spoke to Peter, he spoke about his family in glowing terms, especially his grand- and great-grandfathers, the former of whom Peter claimed had been given a bravery award after World War II for helping Jewish people to escape the Holocaust. A bit of digging by the journalists, though, uncovered the truth, which was that his great-grandfather had in fact been a well-documented, abusive and violent alcoholic, and his grandfather had actually actively assisted the Nazi effort to round up Jewish people and deliver them to the death camps. When his role in this had been revealed after the war, the man who had been a judge prior to the war had been stripped of his position and his pension for his crimes. Peter and his grandfather were incredibly close, though. Individuals who had gone to school with Peter had spoken to the journalists about how Peter was known as the piercing man. From as early as 11 years old, Peter would bring needles and a lighter to school and pierce the other children's ears. The journalists spoke to classmates independently, and they all provided the same narrative of Peter, as young as he was, framing his actions as a test of their strength and character. Almost like a tiny little cult leader, he'd been able to convince the boys that allowing him to stick a needle through their ears was almost a badge of honor. One described it feeling as though he were under some kind of spell, and it was only the pain and aftermath that brought him back to reality. And he couldn't explain to his gobsmacked parents why he had allowed this boy to do this to him. Most expressed, though, that it seemed very important to Peter that his patients, if you will, agreed to the piercing. And this didn't seem to be a matter of him wanting to be sure that they were actually consenting. It was more like this was part of the lure for him. The convincing. The power of taking the mind of someone who had never considered getting their ears pierced, and with only suggestion and words, convincing them to agree to it. Incredibly bizarre, especially for an 11-year-old, right? Right. Keep that little piece of info with you, because it's going to come back later. Long before Peter was interested in sticking needles in his classmates, though, he developed an obsession with guns. He was 10 years old when he received his first gun as a gift, and after that, almost all his spare time was spent on guns and shooting. He was also quite the young criminal, going around town shooting unsafely at targets he'd made, once stealing a few sticks of dynamite from a fire station. And there was animal cruelty too, with an incident reported during which he had allegedly stoned a wild boar to death, despite having a gun in his hand with which he could have easily delivered a swift and relatively painless death. The other side of this rather wild and rebellious young man, as the journalist would soon discover, existed in his mother's presence. Peter's mother was a midwife, and her journey had apparently helped foster an intense interest in surgical equipment and human anatomy in Peter. She also apparently babied her oldest son, and he slept in her bed until he was 14 years old, according to his siblings. Perhaps the most disturbing of allegations around Peter's family did involve his siblings, specifically his sister. Of course, none of this was mentioned by Peter to the journalists when they met with him. In fact, he didn't even mention having a sister. But the journalists discovered she'd existed during their investigations. They also sadly found out that she had passed away in her 40s from alcoholism-induced liver failure. With alcoholism seemingly running in the Frederiksen's genes, this may not be surprising. But the woman, whose name was Lean, was, according to her husband and her brother, actually self-medicating a horrific trauma with alcohol during her life. Both men confirmed to the journalists when they made contact that Lean had been the victim of numerous rapes throughout her childhood and teenage years. According to her brother and husband, the perpetrators had been her grandfather and her brother Peter. Although Lean was already deceased when the journalists learned this, her husband had given them written statements she'd made regarding the rapes. These crimes were never reported to the police, and Lean and Peter's younger brother says he wished he'd done so himself when he discovered it. But Lean hadn't wanted to rip the family apart, and she'd been afraid of the consequences for herself too. Now, of course, Peter Frederiksen was never convicted of raping his sister, so all of these are unproven allegations. Take from this what you will. But the allegations have not just come from Leon, and the story has been consistent from everyone telling it. Peter would have been a teenager at this time. Peter's father ran a roof thatching company which did very well. But initially, at least, Peter wasn't a good fit to work in the business when he left school. And when he was 23, the man's relationship with the African continent began when he joined a trip with an NGO to go work in Kenya. Peter would later say that he'd met a Kenyan woman who he describes as his first love during that time, and he remained in a relationship with her for the 2 years he spent in that country. He told the journalists that he'd wanted to marry the woman and have children with her, but the NGO cancelled his contract, and although he tried to get his father to intervene on his behalf so he could stay in Kenya, his father eventually told him there was no hope, and he had to return to Denmark, which he did in 1977. If Peter was heartbroken at having to leave his first love behind in Kenya, it didn't take him long to get over that, as in the same year as his return to Denmark, he met a woman called Vivian, who would eventually become his wife. Peter also started working at his father's thatching business. The following year, Peter and Vivian welcomed their first child together. Vivian quickly learned that her new partner was rather unconventional in his ways. Peter was still completely obsessed with guns, rebellious toward authority, and always on the lookout for ways to bend the rules of society to his whim. By 1985, Peter's father had passed away, and he'd taken on the responsibility of running the family land. He also married Vivian in that year, but once he figured out that Danish tax laws were not as favourable for married couples as they were for singles, he divorced her in 1988, but they remained in a relationship, raising their child and living together. After Peter's father's death, he used some of his inheritance to buy himself a large plot of land. He kept wild boar on the land, and also started his own thatching business, which he registered in Vivian's name. With a large plot of land and many outbuildings, as well as the main house, it appears that Peter began to build up a cache of firearms during this time. The exact number was never really determined, but many staff members at the farm claimed that there were, at minimum, several hundred. There were allegedly guns everywhere, in the roof rafters, in cupboards, under beds. You couldn't open a door or walk 5 steps, one ex-employee said, without seeing several guns. In 1990, Peter and Vivian's second child was born. Vivian would never publicly speak about her time with Peter Frederiksen, but his betrayal of her would later be laid bare after he was arrested and all of his prior transgressions came to light. Most people working at the Frederiksen home simply ignored the enormous cache of guns on the property. As long as they were being paid for their work, they were happy to keep their mouths shut. But one man, Lars Armin, couldn't keep this information to himself. He'd identified several illegal weapons among the cache, and he was very concerned about what Peter might be planning to do with them. So, in 1991, Lars made a report to police. Initially, he'd asked to be kept anonymous, as he feared reprisal from Peter. Already at this point, Peter had a reputation locally as someone who did not take any slights toward him lightly. He was also known to hold grudges for a very long time, and if you crossed him, you never quite knew when he would come to take revenge. But he always would. His acts of revenge were not petty either. Peter's brother-in-law claims that after they'd had a disagreement, Peter had cut the brake line on his van, and he'd almost died. As he was unable to prove that it was Peter who'd done it, no action was taken. But the man stayed far away from his brother-in-law after that. Other neighbours and local residents had similar, less dramatic stories of retribution from Peter for even perceived slights. Often these incidents involved their outbuildings inexplicably being set alight. So it made sense that Lars had wanted to keep his name out of it when he'd made his report to police. But it's clear that Peter did eventually figure out who had reported him. The probe into Peter Frederiksen took quite some time to get off the ground. And between Lars having made the report and any actual action being taken against Peter, Peter and Vivian welcomed their third child. Then, one day in September 1992, Danish police descended on the Frederiksen premises, and during a raid, a huge number of illegal firearms were seized. I do have to wonder if Peter had seen the paperwork related to this case that day, and perhaps that is where he saw Lars Armand's name. Either way, Peter was not immediately arrested. Years later, when the Danish reporters sat in Peter's South African townhouse interviewing him, they didn't know much about this raid in 1992. They certainly knew nothing about the man who had leaked the information to police in the first place. Lars hadn't ever featured on their radar, neither his life nor his death. But Peter Frederiksen was eager to tell them about the strange way his employee had died. Lars Armand was found dead in his home the day after the raid on Peter's farm. The man was in his mid-30s. There was no sign of external injuries, and eventually police determined he died of a sudden heart attack. The journalists explained how during their time talking to Peter, he had this habit of telling stories about people he knew who died. Very often, the stories involved his theory that the individual was actually poisoned, but he would take great pleasure in emphasizing how on each occasion a police investigation had either ignored the possibility completely or another cause had been attributed. He never went so far as to say that he had any involvement in these deaths, mind you. But after his eventual arrest in South Africa, and once they had his diaries, the journalists started to suspect that these stories had not been arbitrary tales of tragic deaths at all, but rather possible confessions. When Peter was arrested in South Africa, besides the gruesome finds in the freezer, police also found a relatively large amount of medication bottles. Investigations showed that these were medicines that had been brought in from Denmark, and were all very dangerous medications that should not be in the hands of an unlicensed person. Many of these medications could be used to sedate people, and we'll talk about what he might have used those for in South Africa later. But other medications, when used in certain quantities, could cause heart failure. Almost all the medications were actually used in veterinary practice, and when Peter was running his farm, as well as his parents' land, he had close relationships with several local veterinarians who treated his livestock. Once the journalists started reading Peter's diaries and knew about his cache of medications, they started to look at Peter's stories very differently. They went back and made inquiries about the death of Lars Armand. Peter told the journalists that Lars had died at a restaurant. He described a scene where Lars had been having a beer with someone, and Lars had got up to go to the toilet. Peter claimed that the man who'd been with Lars that night had made a throwaway comment as Lars walked away from the table about the fragility of life, and how you never quite knew when your time would come. He said when Lars had returned, he'd taken a few sips of his beer and started to foam at the mouth, before eventually collapsing in the car park outside and dying. At the time, the journalists had taken the story at face value. But when they started to dig a little deeper, they discovered that Lars hadn't died at a restaurant at all. He'd been at his home, and neighbours reported that on the night of his death, Lars had had a visitor, who no one could ever identify. And the next morning, Lars was found dead in his home. Again, this was the same day as the raid happened at Peter's farm. The raid that had been sparked by Lars's tip-off. Peter Frederiksen was never prosecuted in connection with the death of Lars Armand, and Danish police have never reopened the investigation into his death. Around many of these stories that Peter would tell, he would add the tag on that it was actually quite easy to kill people by means of poisoning or drugging them, as if you didn't leave any telltale signs and police didn't know to look for a specific substance, your poison or drug of choice would never be identified. And Peter was not entirely wrong. Even today, in the most well-equipped labs on Earth, it is not possible to test for every single conceivable substance. One reason is that many compounds or identifiers of substances already naturally occur in the body, or could be in other medication the victim is taking. So something coming up doesn't necessarily give off a red flag. And another reason is there are simply far too many substances on Earth that can be deadly in large amounts for everything to be tested for. I mean, you can die from drinking too much water under specific conditions. Almost everything in the world can kill you if you get the quantities and the timing right. Or wrong, I guess. If Lars had really died in the restaurant the way Peter had described and had been foaming at the mouth before his death, I am sure Danish police would have looked deeper into his death and tested for a few different substances at least. But Lars didn't die in public. There were no reports of foaming at the mouth after drinking a beer, because the only person who might have known about that would be the unidentified man who was seen leaving Lars's home that night. Peter seemed to know, though. Lars's death made an appearance in Peter's diary, too. It was a brief mention, and rather offhanded, something along the lines of, Lars died, probably poisoning. This would be the first death to appear in the timeline of Peter Frederiksen, but certainly not the first time someone around him was seriously injured or experienced loss of property after having crossed him. The case against Peter Frederiksen for the firearms was not really impacted by Lars's death. By then, police had already found all the evidence they needed. But as would be the case in South Africa, Peter seemed really good at dodging the law and any real consequences for his actions. In this instance, he received only a fine, which he paid, and it seems he went straight back to collecting illegal firearms right after that. Peter would tell the journalists that in 1995, he had become involved in sex clubs in Denmark. He quite proudly told the uncomfortable journalists that his sex drive and prowess in the bedroom had always been more than any one woman could handle. And he had developed some fetishes that his wife was not interested in exploring with him. The clubs Peter became involved in were mainly of the BDSM variety, so involving bondage, domination, and sadomasochism. And he would make some pretty wild claims about the people he met and what he was introduced to at this time. He told the journalists that he had become involved with a woman who he claimed was a high priestess of an occult group. He'd become close with her, presumably sexually, and she told him of a fantasy she had that she wanted him to help her achieve. The woman, he claimed, wanted to have her clitoris and parts of her external genitalia removed in a ritual-like act. She allegedly believed the removal of these body parts would help her to be less distracted by lust and bring her closer to purity, and she wanted Peter to do it. Peter claimed that this was his first experience of anyone talking about this sort of thing, and his first thought was that it sounded very dangerous, and he was worried that she would bleed a lot. But the woman begged him to do it, and so he eventually agreed, and the act had been undertaken. As he had feared, there was a lot of bleeding, and Peter says he'd eventually telephoned his mother, who had been a midwife, of course, and asked her for her advice. Seemingly not too taken aback that her son was performing unnecessary medical procedures on women's genitalia, Mother Frederiksen had explained a technique using ice to stop the bleeding. It had worked, and he alleged that the high priestess was ultimately very happy with the result of her circumcision. After this, Peter claimed that word had got out in the sex clubs, and many more women approached him to have the same procedure done. Eventually, he said he realized that if he was going to provide this service, he was going to have to figure out how to do it properly. Now, before we move on with this, let's just remind ourselves of something. Peter Frederiksen has had this obsession with making alterations to other people's bodies since he was 11 years old. And even when he was 11, it was key to his apparent enjoyment of the process that the individuals appear to agree to have this done. And yes, it would absolutely likely be coerced consent, and not real at all. But Peter wanted it all the same. Whether that was about him enjoying the process of manipulating people, or it somehow eased some element of his conscience, is difficult to say. But it's clear that when he claims these hordes of women were suddenly beating down his door in Denmark to have their genitals altered by him, that is very much a Peter perception, and not the truth of the matter. I believe he had found a new way to combine his desire for power, his obsession with having that power and control over another person's body, and his interest in anatomy into one activity. Peter claims that in order to learn how to properly perform female circumcisions, he went straight to the man who was famous for his medical knowledge of genitalia. Dr. Jorn Eg Siana was an infamous Danish plastic surgeon who was known by his nickname Dr. Penis. Dr. Penis was known for his own specialized procedure he developed, which he claimed helped to enlarge male genitalia. Now, Dr. Siana could never be asked about his alleged tuition of Frederiksen because he died in 2014, and his own life and career were mired in controversy. You can read about that online. The journalist did get confirmation from a few of Peter's friends from that time that Peter was involved in the circumcision of women, and one man said that he had been present when Peter had allegedly received a bag of medical equipment given to him by his mother. Peter told the journalist that he continued to perform these procedures for women. He says sought him out at the sex clubs, and he became relatively skilled at it. Perhaps this is a good time to address this procedure Peter is referring to and talk a bit about its history, what exactly it is, how it ties in several different cultures around the world, including in Africa, and how it's been addressed by modern human rights groups and international law. The word circumcision, for the most part, is usually linked with male genitalia, in which the foreskin is removed for religious, cultural, or medical reasons. In male children, or sometimes adults, it is a practice that is still widely accepted, and medical professionals do acknowledge that there are potential health benefits to male circumcision, including the possibility of reduced risk of STI transfer. In South Africa and other countries in the world, it is a practice undertaken for cultural and religious reasons too. Male circumcision in infants was at one point pretty much understood as the thing to do, and many parents in the 70s and 80s, for instance, didn't always realize that they had a choice. Today in South Africa, male circumcision is still an option. For a long time, there was confusion around whether circumcising a child under 16 was actually legal or not, as the Children's Act of 2005 seemed to forbid it. Legal minds have since weighed in, though, and it is now more clear that a medical practitioner can perform circumcisions for religious or medical reasons, as long as there has been informed consent of the guardians or parents of the child and all the risks have been explained. In South Africa and other African countries, male circumcision is often part of the initiation into manhood ceremony. The Children's Act does prohibit circumcisions in these cases in boys under 16, and for those older than 16, informed consent must be given. There have unfortunately been a large number of botched circumcisions during initiations, which have resulted in severe illness, permanent injury, and even death. To try to counter this, the government has required that initiation schools register for each initiation season and comply with specific health and safety standards. As you will soon hear, male circumcision has been seen in a very different light because there are actual recorded health benefits. I will say, though, that there are those who feel that the possible benefits do not justify what is essentially an unnecessary medical alteration to a human being's body without their consent. It is a deeply fraught issue because of the recorded health benefits and the fact that there is still widely accepted cultural and religious aspects around male circumcision. When we shift the focus to what has been referred to as female circumcision, everything looks very different. From the outset in the section, although I've said the words female circumcision to try and compare it in some way with the male equivalent procedure, this phrase is no longer used. It is now widely internationally accepted that any alteration of female genitalia has no medical benefit, and in fact, rather has many medical hazards, and as such, the act is referred to as female genital mutilation. In 2005, many countries across the world ratified what is referred to as the Maputo Protocol, which declares female genital mutilation as a human rights violation. Female genital mutilation occurs in various forms across the world for many different reasons. For the most part, these are either religious or cultural. Some cultures cite it as a method to improve cleanliness or to avoid women being driven by lust. Others see it simply as a rite of passage. The cleanliness argument is, of course, not medically supported. In fact, mutilation of the protective tissues of the female genitals can actually increase the chance of infections. In many cases of female genital mutilation, the external part of the clitoris is removed completely. This, of course, can greatly reduce a woman's enjoyment of sex. At its most severe, some forms of female genital mutilation involve the stitching of a seal across the vagina, leaving a small opening for the passage of urine and menstrual blood. A thin layer of scar tissue will form around the stitching, and on the woman's first night with her husband, he is expected to break through the seal with his penis to be sure of her virginity. This latter form has largely been stopped after a huge number of women who had experienced this form of mutilation died in childbirth because their birth canal had been altered by the mutilation, and the child could not move past the obstruction created. Female genital mutilation is not just an African practice. In fact, it occurs with equal frequency across the world in different countries. The sad irony is that even in the countries with the highest instance of this practice, the vast majority of the population are actually against it. The cultural leaders to whom the practice is alleged to belong have themselves spoken out against it. But what has seemed to have happened is that the matriarchs of families, who themselves were mutilated as children, have so deeply absorbed this practice as necessary to keep their girl children free from the ills of the world that they are driving its continuation behind closed doors. In some countries, activists have started working with matriarchs in affected communities to develop symbolic circumcisions so that they can still observe their culture while not harming the girl children in their families. Female genital mutilation in various forms is horrifically widespread and really occurs in many cultures or religions where female purity is seen as a measure of goodness. The sad irony is that in these very same groups, bearing of children and fertility is seen as equally valuable, and many women who experience this mutilation end up infertile or unable to carry a pregnancy to term. I've spoken quite clinically about this topic in this explanation, but I will say that researching this topic for this episode has been one of the most horrifying topics I've delved into in the last 6 years. And let me tell you, I've seen some pretty dark stuff. Now back to Peter and his claims that in Denmark, women were seeking him out to perform genital mutilations on them. There is a very fine line that exists here. Peter was involved in sex clubs, which were distinctly on the fringes of what could be considered mainstream BDSM. Genital modification in women is not unheard of in these communities, but these usually involve piercings in the labia or clitoris or a reduction in the hood of tissue which covers the clitoris to enhance sexual experience. At no time did Peter actually tell the journalists that he was performing these latter procedures, though. And if that is what the women in Denmark thought they were getting, if they were ever even consulted to that extent, they would have been shocked at what actually happened. What Peter was doing was not any form of modification for perceived benefit. It was outright mutilation. There is, unfortunately, no way to know exactly how many women Peter subjected to procedures like this in Denmark, although I tend to think he was not nearly as prolific there as he would eventually be in South Africa. Women in Denmark are far less vulnerable in many ways than women in South Africa. Of course, as you'll hear in one more story from Denmark before we switch continents, they were absolutely just as vulnerable to manipulation and coercive control. But these were relatively resourced women who knew their rights and would quickly have called police. So Peter would have had to have been very selective about who he victimized in Denmark, and he certainly was. In 1996, Peter was once again in trouble with Danish police, but not for female genital mutilation. Rather, for the 43 kilograms of explosives that they found in his freezer. There was never any clarification about what Peter might have planned to use these explosives for. But again, there was this pattern of behavior. He stole dynamite sticks from a firehouse when he was a child, and we already know what South African police would eventually find in his freezer here many years later. Peter received his first serious conviction in Denmark for this offence. There's no information about whether he served any prison time for it, but it is likely he would have been able to pay a fine. For the next 4 years in Denmark, Peter had no major incidents to speak of, until 2001, when he met a woman who is referred to as Inga. This is not her real name, but she was so terrified of Peter that when the Danish journalists tracked her down, she refused to talk unless she was kept anonymous. Inga had just come out of a very difficult relationship when she met Peter. For a large part of their relationship, Inga believed that Peter was single. He was not, though, and he was still with Vivian, the mother of his children, although by that point he had already had several affairs. In retrospect, Inga believed that Peter had specifically targeted her when she was in a vulnerable state, and she's probably absolutely correct. Many of the women the journalist tracked down who Peter had written about in his diaries had been either freshly divorced or newly broken up from their partners when they met Peter. What Inga describes experiencing was absolute love bombing. She believed herself to be the center of his universe. She had never felt so loved. She dropped her guard with him in ways she had never done before and trusted him implicitly. He turned his abusive and controlling behaviors on very slowly. And then Peter seemed to get bored. And he told Inga he was leaving her to start again with Vivian. In truth, he had never left Vivian. Despite his abusive behavior, Inga was still very much under Peter's spell, and she wrote him a long love letter begging him to give her another chance. Inga's initial hesitance to speak to the journalists was not just about her fear of Peter. It was also because she felt deeply shameful. A shame that was certainly not hers to carry, but one that she carried nonetheless. Because writing that letter, she realized, had invited this man back into her life. And what would happen then would be more horrendous than anything she'd ever experienced. For a while after she sent the letter, Peter ignored her. Then, just as she was beginning to come to terms with a life without him, out of the blue, he phoned her. He said he wanted to speak to her about her vagina. Over the next few weeks, Peter played a rather sick game with Inga. She says she had no idea what he had in mind, but he started getting her to collect parcels he would send. In one was medication. In others, scalpels and other medical equipment. In another, needles and sutures. Inga had played role-playing sex games with Peter before, so she assumed this had something to do with the new kink he'd thought up. He arranged to meet Inga for what she believed would be a romantic evening in Sweden. She drove 3 hours to meet him at a lodge there. Please note that the following is very difficult to listen to. Inga said that the first sign that something was wrong was when Peter started preparing a syringe of something, which he proceeded to quickly inject into her arm. She protested, and he told her that she'd be grateful for it when it was all done. Over the next few hours, Inga says she drifted in and out of consciousness. She believed that Peter had applied some local anesthetic to her groin region, because although she felt pressure and sensation, there was no real pain at first. As she lapsed in and out of awareness, she caught brief glimpses of what he was doing to her as he worked with the scalpel and needle and suture between her legs. By the time she had any type of real consciousness again, she realized that her clitoris had been sliced off, along with large parts of her inner and outer labia. She would only realize later that Peter had also performed the most severe of genital mutilations on her. He had sutured her vaginal opening closed, leaving just a small space for urine and menstrual blood to escape. Inga was in shock. Peter kept her at the lodge for a few days, and during that time he instilled such a deep fear in her of what would happen if she ever reported him, that Inga would never utter a word until she heard he'd been arrested. She also told the journalists, and again, a content warning here, that during the days after she was mutilated, Peter had told her about the traditions of African people he allegedly engaged with while he was in Kenya in his youth. He claimed that the young women would be made to eat their clitoral tissue to give them greater fertility. Now, there is absolutely no proof that this has ever been a thing anywhere in the world, and it's even more unlikely that a random white foreigner would be given information about such a controversial and sensitive practice, even just around the genital mutilation in general. But that is what he told Inga. And on her last day at the lodge, she claims that Peter brought her what she initially thought was chicken soup, but came to believe may have actually contained her own genital tissue. There were times when Inga believed Peter was going to kill her at the lodge. So when he set her free and told her to go home and never speak to anyone of what they'd done, she did just that. For 5 months, Inga lived with the pain of the mutilation done to her, until eventually she was becoming physically ill and consulted a doctor. She never says whether the doctor asked about her injuries or suggested she contact police, but she did undergo surgery in an attempt to at least remove the suturing from her vagina. Again, I must state that Peter Frederiksen was never asked to answer to these allegations in court, and as such he is legally not guilty of them. However, I will also say that Inga had absolutely no knowledge of Peter's case in South Africa when the journalist knocked on her door. In fact, she had been in hiding for years, believing him to still be in Denmark. So it would be unlikely that she would make up a story so similar to what he would eventually be accused of, again, so many thousands of kilometers away. And really, of what Peter himself had admitted doing to others. And before I move on from this, I just want to point something else out that shows that Inga really did have reason to fear Peter. 12 years after she had last seen Peter Frederiksen, he had phoned Inga from South Africa. She had no idea he was phoning from outside of the country, of course, but it was around that time that things were closing in on him here. And he clearly wanted to make sure that Inga wasn't going to talk if anyone tracked her down. This was a behavior that Peter would show time and again. He never let his victims go. He would toy with them, and if he didn't feel he'd gotten a severe enough vengeance, he would go back and hurt them again in a different way. It was undoubtedly a pattern. In 2004, Peter married Vivian again. If you think that this was his attempt to restart a healthy relationship and set his path straight, you would unfortunately be wrong. It was very tactical. Peter was under investigation for firearms offences again, and this time, with a previous record, he knew he was facing prison time. In Denmark, the courts recognized the need to maintain marital harmony even during criminal litigation. So one spouse cannot be forced to testify against another spouse. If he had not married Vivian, she could have been called as a witness in his trial. As his wife, she could choose not to if she was called. And it's at this point that I can clarify why I mentioned that Anna's eventual marriage to Peter in 2010 was not what she thought. You see, Peter could not legally marry Anna because when they met, he was still married to Vivian. To add to his laundry list of crimes, Peter Frederiksen was a bigamist. But that's jumping too far ahead. After marrying Vivian, Peter started preparations for a plan he was putting in place. In 2005, he somehow managed to have 2 passports produced in his name. Each had a different place of birth on them. In 2006, police searched Peter's farm again. They once again found a huge stash of illegal weapons. It would later emerge that they also found photographs in Peter's house, and depicted in those pictures were scenes of female genital mutilation. No investigation was done into these pictures, but it's very likely that Peter was concerned that he was about to be caught out for a lot more than weapons charges. Peter was charged and arrested, but released on bail. Within a few days of his release, he had wrapped up his plan. He said goodbye to his children and wife and boarded a plane to South Africa. Peter Frederiksen was on the run. And this is where I'm going to wrap up part 1 of episode 199, The Crimes of Peter Frederiksen. Part 2 will appear in your feed very shortly.